Welcome back to another episode of Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Sebastian Lebrec. We begin the 10th season of the podcast with a Back to Parliament episode. The House of Commons returns today after the summer break. While the House was not sitting, there was no shortage of important political news and intrigue. The Liberals lost a by-election in a Toronto riding that was thought to be a stronghold for them. More recently, the NDP ended their supply and confidence agreement with the Liberals. In the meantime, the Conservatives had a good summer and were riding high in the polls, leading the Liberals by nearly 20%. There's a lot to unpack in Canadian politics as we get ready for the fall sitting. To help us understand the dynamics at play, I invited Steele and Garry Keller, two vice presidents at Strategy Corp. My colleague Nasha Brownridge is also joining us. Nasha is a senior consultant and a true expert in everything NDP. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, let's start with the end of the supply and confidence agreement between the Liberals and the NDP. As I mentioned at the top, that's kind of a defining moment of the summer. Nasha, in your opinion, what was the calculus or the motivation for the NDP to break up with the Liberals? Like, how did that come about?
So I don't think many people were surprised that it came this fall. I think what surprised many people is that it happened before the House returned, and it didn't happen right when the Liberals essentially intervened in the rail strikes using Section 107. I do think that was one of the main motivations. As we all know, the NDP, that union vote, that labor-oriented group is really significant to them, and it's a big voter base. I also think, bluntly, we have two by-elections underway, and the NDP, like all the parties, has been knocking on doors, and they're likely hearing dissatisfaction from potential voters that they remained in this agreement. So ahead of the caucus retreat, I think it was actually a really smart move by Jagmeet Singh to make this decision, because he got to walk into that caucus room ready to go, new vision, new way forward, and also continue in the knocking on those doors in the by-election and not facing that, I guess, angry side of the voter base that isn't happy that they're in that agreement. So timing both surprising and not surprising, if you honestly ask that question.
That's fair. Andrew, what does this mean concretely for the Liberals moving forward? And do you think the NDP stays the preferred dance partner of Justin Trudeau, or does this position the Bloc differently in the House?
The NDP made the agreement in a position of weakness. They weren't able to go to the polls, and rather than get whipsawed every time a vote came up, they made the supply and confidence agreement to kind of get something for their votes, right? And try to maximize their yields with dental care and pharmacare and all those good progressive things. The end of the agreement is kind of curious because it also came about out of weakness, right? Singh was going into caucus. He likely was going to have to get rid of the agreement anyway, and so chose to kind of get rid of it first. But substantively, it's not going to mean we're suddenly going to an election. It doesn't mean we're suddenly, seeing a huge increase in instability in the legislature. It does slightly increase the unintended consequence of this vote or that. But if anything, it's kind of energized Liberals. When I talk to folks in the Prime Minister's office, they're like, great, game on. Like, it's been peace in the Progressive Valley for more than 2 years. Now they kind of get to differentiate themselves from the NDP, and there's opportunity in that. The interesting question is, as you said, there's two potential dance partners for the Liberals. They can achieve a majority vote with either the NDP or the Bloc Québécois. The Bloc has set its price of admission pretty low. Assistance for seniors. Well, that's pretty broad and pretty universally loved. So I have a feeling the Liberals will be able to make that. So now they've got the opportunity to parlay between two different parties to try to get an outcome that they want. In some ways, it's weakened both the NDP and the Bloc Québécois negotiating position, but ultimately it's going to be a question of how long can the Liberals stay in office, how long do they want to stay in office. But certainly I think through the fall, we're highly unlikely to see an election, particularly with the NDP having an election coming in British Columbia provincially that they'll need to throw all their resources at to stay in government.
So, Garry, the Liberals and the NDP went through a breakup during the summer. What kind of summer did the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre have?
Well, the term "brat summer." I think Pierre Poilievre had the brat summer of all. I mean, he started off the summer, kicked it off with winning the Toronto St. Paul's by-election in a riding the Conservatives have not held in many, many, many years. handing an important victory and really cementing his message. He's been very busy this summer. He has been to 9 provinces. He has had 75 events, 86 ridings he's covered. You name it, he's been out there. He's been everywhere, man, as the saying goes. He had a successful Stampede where he was also everywhere. And in the Calgary Stampede, for those who don't know, it's increasingly becoming a very heavy political event, a see and be seen event with federal and provincial stakeholders. And so he was very present at that. Showing up at the opening of an envelope, flipping pancakes, major fundraising. He's really checked all the boxes this summer. And he's also encouraged his caucus and his candidates to be out there door knocking all over the place this summer. As noted, we have these 2 by-elections coming up later tonight, and the Conservatives are neck and neck with the New Democrats in the Manitoba one, in the city of Winnipeg and Elma-Transcona, which is traditionally an NDP seat, but has been Conservative from 2011 to 2015. And it sounds like it is a dead heat. So he won a by-election at the beginning of the summer. We'll see if he can win another by-election as the House of Commons returns from its summer break later today.
Andrew, what do you make of those by-elections? How much can you read the tea leaves if you're in PMO and looking at the results?
By-elections are not general elections, right? I think there's a consensus that while the Conservatives won the St. Paul's by-election because it was a by-election, they're unlikely to hold it in a general election when the stakes are different and the choices are different. So they're hard to generalize against a general election. That said, they can be important. They can be symbolic. They can have a value to the narrative, and they can really speak to voters' positions. I think the by-elections tonight matter, particularly, if the NDP wins both, that's going to be a big boost for them. And I think the nightmare scenario for Liberals is, the NDP gets a real boost. They wind up getting a bit of a bump in the polls. They somehow sneak ahead of the Liberals in national polling, and suddenly there's a real challenge. So I think we could see something pretty strong coming out tonight if that scenario happens. If, the Bloc Québécois or even the Liberals win the Quebec seat, the Conservatives win the Manitoba seat, that scenario doesn't happen. I think they're probably in a relatively strong position.
So as we mentioned, the House returns today. Nasha, I'll go to you next. From the perspective of the NDP, what will be the main policy and political priorities now that the confidence in supply agreement is in the rearview mirror?
Well, so I do think, fundamentally, when it comes to the politics of it all, the NDP, just like the Liberals, they are going to be focusing on differentiating themselves. For more than 2 years, they've been working with the Liberals. They've been supporting legislation in exchange for really key wins. So I think of pharmacare immediately. That's still going to be on the legislative agenda, and that is something that both Trudeau has said that he will continue with, and I think that Jagmeet's priority is going to be making sure that the NDP essentially gets credit for that with Canadians, which is going to be a challenge because it is effectively government legislation. But beyond that, I think in terms of policies they're going to be focusing on, coming out of their caucus retreat last week, we saw announcements reflecting the affordability concern that, of course, we're hearing about across party lines. So they've been discussing, for example, they made an announcement to restrict corporate takeover on affordable rentals. So once again, they're looking at that core base, and they're thinking of ways, in some cases, some would argue, out of jurisdiction, that the federal government can get involved in things like rentals. They're also talking about the environment, and there was the so-called controversial discussion surrounding the carbon tax, albeit slightly misleading, in that the NDP has always said that it is corporations and polluters that need to pay. So we are expecting a new environmental platform, or at least policy framework, something to come out of the NDP really soon. And I think that's going to be a huge focus for them, because as we know, that's what Pierre Poilievre is trying to make this election about, and the NDP is trying to match. So I think those will be some of the main priorities, along with labor disputes that are outcoming. We are going to see the NDP fighting strongly against any form of government intervention in strikes.
So, Garry, I suspect we're going to hear Mr. Poilievre talk about axe the tax. I suspect we might see a confidence vote in the fall, but beyond those relatively sure bets, what will we see from the Conservatives from a policy and political standpoint?
I think you're going to continue to see the keep it simple strategy here. It's going to be very focused on we need a carbon tax election, quote unquote. He's going to attack the Prime Minister and Mr. Singh directly. He's in Quebec. He's increasingly attacked Mr. Blanchet and the Bloc Québécois for propping up the Liberals. But I think it really is keeping that message simple. Now, this fall, when the House of Commons comes back, we're going to have 7 opposition days where the opposition gets to set the agenda for debate for the day. The Conservatives get 5 of those, and in each one of them, they can bring a quote-unquote non-confidence vote to the floor of the House of Commons. And I expect that they will, to not just test the confidence of the House, but also to put pressure on both the New Democrats and the Bloc Québécois to say, which one of you is going to back up the Liberal government at this point? Because on their own, of course, the Liberals don't have the numbers. They need another player in all of this to help back them up. So I expect more of the same. I also expect for those who watch Parliament and are dependent on the work of parliamentary committees to get legislation through, we're going to see a lot of chaos in the parliamentary committees. The Conservatives will use every tactic they have at their disposal to try to slow the government's agenda. For example, we've seen just today on the order paper for the House of Commons, the Conservatives have introduced massive numbers of amendments to all sorts of government legislation that simply doesn't do anything except make tactical amendments. They're just trying to delay things and throw the government's legislative agenda into chaos. And so expect to see a lot of that this fall from the Conservatives.
What about the Liberals, Andrew?
The objective this autumn. One is to drive and take the credit for a number of the outcomes of social policy that came out of the NDP Accord. So they're rolling out dental care, they're rolling out pharmacare, they're rolling out potential deals with provinces around free birth control and diabetes medications. And now there's no automatic Jagmeet Singh standing next to them for those announcements. And so they're able to say, look at us, the Liberal government, look what we're doing. Jagmeet Singh's not on side here. We got the Bloc Québécois backing us for confidence on this one, or whatever it is. So the more they can differentiate from the NDP in this period, the better off they are with the progressive voters and holding that block of progressives together. So they are, step 2, the opposition to the Conservatives, that they can make this a choice, not a referendum. I think there's a great saying, measure me against the alternative, not the almighty, that is really Justin Trudeau's only get out of jail free card here. So he needs to make this a choice between himself and the Conservatives and hold together that progressive coalition if he has a hope of doing very well at all in a coming up election. So part of it is starting to frame that choice, starting to frame it as a choice, and using Parliament as an opportunity to frame that choice. And the third thing is Trudeau needs to kind of fend off the inevitable, resignation calls and change, and which is kind of a cottage industry when polls get bad. So, they had a good caucus meeting. He set up and said he was running again. Nobody called him on it. Feels like the party's a bit more united than it was going in. Those are some positive things, but that could flare up if the by-elections are not perfect for them tonight. That could flare up if anything happens. But notice how he's grabbed an opponent, a potential leadership challenger like Mark Carney, and pulled him into the party and kind of neutered him in a way and brought him into the tent. So you can see a bit of crafty Pierre Senior in the current machinations that Justin is making by neutering some of his opponents, John Turnering them, if you will. And I will conclude there.
That's a great throwback to history, but I'm actually going to stay with you, Andrew. So budget 2025 will be the last federal budget before the election. How will the Liberals approach this? Will the budget basically be the Liberal platform for the next election?
I mean, that's a big question. So what I would say, first of all, is there's kind of 2 budgets, right? There's the one that is the kind of Government of Canada budget, which is many different pieces of public policy that are critical to the peace, order, and good government of our nation. And then there is a political budget that kind of sits on top of that. And obviously in the election year, it's a much more political budget that happens. The Liberals have a choice. Do they want to run and pass this budget? Do they want to get it through and have an election in October? So then it is a look at us, this is the things we're delivering, and the platform is very separate. Or do they want to actually run on the budget which is a different thing where you want it to fail, where you want to set it up so that neither the Bloc nor the NDP back it, and you have an election on the budget. And in some ways, that's a choice you can only answer as you get closer, as you see where the polls are, as you see where your potential opportunities are. But I would suggest they're probably planning for an October election where the budget passes, but a spring election if necessary. And so, but that can change.
So, Garry, in light of what Andrew just mentioned, how will you be advising clients on how to engage with government and the opposition in the coming months? And then Nasha will go to you.
Well, I think it depends what you're looking to do. If you are somebody that has a regulatory or financial decision before the current government, you certainly want to have those decisions made as soon as possible. As possible, meaning possibly this fall before December to be safe, because once we get into 2025, really both government and public service, the reality is people shift into election mode and only the most urgent things need to get done. So if you do have something that's before the government for a decision, get it done as soon as possible. A number of folks are already engaging with the Conservative Party in terms of platform and getting to know them a bit better. The Conservatives really are now moving towards what are you offering in terms of policy ideas? Of course, the leader's office, it's a small but mighty team, but they can't do everything. And they, I know, are looking for ideas, especially those that have costing behind them, because that is only a government ministry of finance can do actual costing. And so you have to rely on other outside providers to do some of that costing. So I know they are looking for those items and are willing to meet with people, but it's only going to get busier and busier as we get closer to an election. And Andrew's right. The Liberals do have some options available to them if they want to be defeated on a spring budget, or they want to take their chances and go into the fall. They don't completely control their fate, of course, but a lot of things can happen behind the scenes, a lot of surprises, just like we saw about a week and a half ago.
Nasha?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely second everything that Garry said. When it comes specifically to engaging with the NDP, I think we're in a super interesting place. So we know before, when it came to the confidence and supply agreement, many people were speaking to Liberals, NDP, seeing what they could kind of get out of that, for lack of a better term. I think now what's interesting is, look, the NDP's made it clear they're going to be making a calculated decision on everything moving forward, because that's what they did prior to that agreement. So I think for any clients or anyone who's trying to engage with the NDP, they have to look at what is that calculation the NDP is going to be making on the ask that they have before them. And look, the Liberals will need a dancing partner on any decision, whether it's the NDP or someone else, to be determined. But to avoid an election, if that's what they want to do, they will need someone to have their back effectively. So I think looking at whether or not it's something the NDP could support and what that calculation would be really, really important. So it's going to be on a case-by-case basis.
That's really interesting. So we alluded to an election in British Columbia and in Saskatchewan. New Brunswick's also going to the polls. So, plenty of provincial elections coming up, even potentially one in Ontario in 2025. Who knows? So what do you think we will see in terms of federal-provincial relationship? Like, how does that play out? Garry, we'll go to you.
Well, in those provinces you noted that are having elections this fall, the federal-provincial relationship will actually go into the deep freeze because of the necessity to do so due to those elections taking place. I think in all three elections, there is a possibility of change in all of them, which could make for a very interesting later fall where you have three new players on the scene. I think at the beginning of the year, if you said that the BC Conservatives would have basically consumed the BC United Party and be either neck and neck or slightly ahead of David Eby and his NDP government, a lot of people would have said, what are you on? But that is the situation we find ourselves in. BC has been fascinating over the last few weeks from a political standpoint, and it looks like it's neck and neck. Saskatchewan, it looks increasingly like we could have a competitive election there. Carla Beck and the New Democrats have been very, very active and are ramping up their advertising. And, just the reality is the Saskatchewan Party has been in power for a long time. And whether you even like or dislike their policies, that's a long time for any government to be in place. And in New Brunswick, too, Blaine Higgs has a competitor in Susan Holt, the Liberal leader. Again, it's increasingly looking like a dead heat. And New Brunswick is a different kettle of fish altogether in terms of linguistics, how the vote breaks that way. And sort of rural urban. But again, it could be a very interesting election outcome. So in some ways, the prime minister doesn't necessarily have to worry about the dynamic too much while those elections are going on. It's the result. Of course, the dynamic with Alberta remains tense at best. Of course, depending on the relationship between the premier and different ministers, and the premier and the prime minister, you can get things done in Alberta on a interprovincial basis, but it depends a lot on what file and what area. And then, of course, Ontario, Doug Ford has been pretty unabashed about his relationship with Chrystia Freeland and Prime Minister Trudeau about getting things done for Ontario. And every economic announcement that is a joint announcement in Ontario, you see the Prime Minister there, Chrystia Freeland there, Doug Ford, and his Economic Development Minister, Vic Fedeli. They've really formed a partnership because they think it works for them in a win-win basis. That being said, to your earlier point, it's rumored that Doug Ford does not want to have a provincial election in Ontario at the same time as a potential federal election. And so we may see an earlier than expected election in Ontario in the spring of 2025.
Andrew, you've been around the block plenty at Queen's Park. So, I suppose one of the reasons Doug Ford might want an election is the theory of blue at Queen's Park, red in Ottawa, and vice versa. Does that still hold? What do you make of this?
The trend line is it's pretty rare for a government of one stripe to win an election at Queen's Park when a government of the same stripe is in power federally. Really, it was like Leslie Frost did it in the 50s while Diefenbaker was prime minister. Dalton McGuinty did it while Paul Martin was the prime minister, but then Martin lost, right? So alternation's a thing. There's not enough cases to prove it, kind of statistically, but it seems to hold some real water. And I think part of it is you can see look at these guys, they're making cuts and we don't want that. So you vote for the other level to kind of balance it off. Ford's government's been pretty centrist. So I don't think it has that kind of repelling factor that motivates progressive voters to have to stick with the Liberals. Frankly, Poilievre does that himself. He's conservative enough and has enough kind of energy to be able to push off against that way. What's really interesting is what happens in British Columbia if a conservative government comes in. Do we see a bunch of cuts? Does that create a dynamic where it's easier for the Liberals to start rallying the not conservative vote? Does it get some people to have a bit of a lunch bag letdown and reconsider, well, I voted conservative provincially, maybe I should vote Liberal federally and just have some balancing so we can protect healthcare or we can watch out for these other issues? So I think we're seeing a period of time where there's pretty much governments of a not liberal stripe across the country provincially. And it's a bit of a dynamic that helps to keep that alternation going federally. And it'll be a tool that the federal Liberals use subtly.
Nasha, what do you think the federal provincial dynamic will look like? Especially, I know you have deep ties in British Columbia with the NDP. So curious to hear you on this.
I agree with what Garry said earlier. These elections could go any way. There was a time maybe 6 months ago, I would have said, EB's got it in the bag, not concerned. Here we are. But with recent events, BC United and the Conservative amalgamation and or disintegration, depending how you look at it, we know now it could go either way. And look, if the NDP wins in BC and in Saskatchewan, that's going to give the federal NDP the pick-me-up they probably need in some way, and they will try to ride that as much as they possibly can. And that could also affect an election timing, assuming it's up to the NDP, because we do have to remember it's not just the NDP anymore. The Bloc can step in anytime and avoid it altogether.
There's one other election that isn't a provincial election, but it's really going to matter this year, and that's the United States presidential election. I think if we see Donald Trump come back to office, there's a very interesting opportunity there for the federal Liberals. It's going to cause a lot of fear. I mean, when you look at the numbers in Canada, I think that when I checked last, Abacus did some polling, and they saw 55% of Canadians would vote for Kamala Harris, just 22% for Trump. There's a lot of negativity around Trump. People love Harris here in Canada. So seeing a conservative Trump protectionist, destabilizing regime come back into office could cause some real fear, and you could see Trudeau try to seek a mandate, perhaps quickly, on trying to deal with Trump. And that's an interesting scenario where if the Democrats get elected, probably a little better for democracy, in my opinion, probably a little better for global stability, probably the same for trade. I think the Democrats are increasingly just as protectionist as the Republicans are. But in the one scenario where Trump gets back into office, that does present a real foil for the prime minister. And then he's not just running against a domestic conservative, he's running against a global conservative.
So that's actually a good segue into our last question. So what does success look like for each party this fall, and what's the biggest risk? Perhaps we'll go to you, Garry, first, since we mentioned how Trudeau might look to paint Pierre Poilievre with a Trump brush. I suppose that's a bit of a risk, isn't it?
Well, of course, but I think the Liberals have been wanting to do that for some time. And of course, the election doesn't take place until the first week of November. And whoever wins the presidential election does not take office until January. And so if the Liberals do want to make that connection, and Mr. Trump does win, I do think they need some time for that to play out into the springtime, which is why, again, I think it is highly unlikely we're going to have a fall election, because I think, if you are the Liberals and you are counting on exogenous events to try to impact and improve your standing, you have to let that American election play out. So for the Conservatives, I think it's quite simple. They want to continue their lead in the polls. They don't want to see, a dip below sort of 12 or 13 points. It's hard to do, but they've kept it up for over a year now. And, they just want to keep doing what they're doing, keep driving that simple message that Mr. Poilievre has of his 4 priorities: axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, stop the crime. And they want to avoid any eruptions from the caucus or conservative candidates that might cause trouble for them in the long run. We call them in politics bozo eruptions, where and sometimes conservatives, both at the federal and provincial levels, are a little bit more prone to them. But, anything that deflects from their key core messages of those 4 priorities, which has been drilled into every member of parliament and every candidate, they've got to stay away from straying from that. And if they do, I think they'll consider that to be successful.
Nasha, we'll go to you next. Prior success and risk for the NDP.
So I'm going to flip it over, but I think the biggest risk right now, there are many. There's these by-elections there and all these things that are going to factor in. But a big piece here is going to be about, look, they spent, again, over 2 years in a supply and confidence agreement. People are seeing them as one with the Liberals. So now they have that opportunity to differentiate themselves and stand out, so to speak. But even bigger than that, we have the issue where Justin Trudeau and the Liberals are trying to, or will definitely be trying to, take credit for some key wins that the NDP attributes to themselves, being pharmacare, dental care, things like anti-scab legislation that really help them. So we have Trudeau taking credit for those. And on the flip side, we've seen lately that Mr. Poilievre of the Conservatives effectively calling it a win. It seems like everything Jagmeet Singh does, it's, we told him to do it. We told him to do it. So there's almost this, I don't want to call it a joke, where it's both sides are taking credit for everything the NDP is doing. And that is a huge risk for them, because they're becoming, or they risk becoming irrelevant in the minds of Canadians, where it's like, Poilievre told you to do that, and Trudeau's actually the one who did that. So they're really in a position where they're going to have to be bold. They're going to have to come up with something, do everything they can to get it in the minds of Canadians and ensure that people understand, like, those pieces of legislation were NDP wins. And the NDP backing out of the agreement was not because Poilievre told them to. So that's going to be a huge challenge. I can't say I have all the answers, but I do know for sure, like, that will be their focus coming into the fall session.
Andrew, you get the last word from the Liberal perspective.
The Liberals need to hold together the Progressive Coalition and stay in charge of it. They need to polarize against the Conservatives and make this a choice, not a referendum on Trudeau. And they need to kind of manage their internal caucus dissent, right? If they do those three things, they can come out of this, I think, with their heads held high. The real issue and opportunity here, the problem, the opportunity, is, as Harold Macmillan famously said, what knocks governments off course? Events, dear boy, events. And so some of those events could be helpful to the Liberals if they manage them right. A Trump election, probably not what I want globally, but could be an aid in some ways to a Liberal restoration and getting back into the contention for the next election. A scandal. We have not had a good rip-roaring scandal in this government since 2019, right? Like it's been a knock on wood. It's been a long time. You know, a exogenous, a real event internationally. We've had so many crazy things going on in the 2020s, from COVID to Trump, like all this stuff. Who knows what's coming? A war in the South China Sea. Who knows? So what I do know is there will be events, and if the government manages them well, or they are able to kind of stay on top of them, that's going to be positive for them. So what I'm going to bet is between now and then, stuff's going to happen none of us know about, nobody could know about, that's going to completely change the dynamic of politics 1, 2, 3, 4 times in this session. And we'll all be talking about, well, who knew the aliens were coming when we do a wrap-up podcast in December.
Stuff is going to happen is probably a fantastic way to summarize the conversation, and we'll leave it at that for now. So it promises to be a very interesting fall session. We'll definitely be turning to all three of you for further analysis at Strategy Corp. So Garry, Andrew, Nasha, thank you very much for joining the podcast today, and have yourself a good fall sitting.
Great to be with you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences. The views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights for this episode are reserved, and the guests on the Intended Consequences podcast might be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the work of the Institute and to subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website at strategycorp.com/institute, and make sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm Sebastian Lebrec, and I intend to talk to you again next episode.